is essential for all life. Pretty much everything living on the earth is reliant on water within its tissues to provide the chemical basis for much of what life is. So we think about DNA and many other things, but the key, I think, is to really realize that water is a defining factor for all life, pretty much. Plants, as we know them, originated from algae. So they started from aquatic systems or marine systems, excuse me, and then they evolved from there. And you think about the diversity of life in water, it's extremely high, and obviously goes back many hundreds of millions of years. Modern plant cells are really adapted for that life coming out on land. So you think about a modern plant cell, it actually is important to remember that plant cells, two different views here. The one on the right is just a cross section, and this shows you a little bit better view in terms of the overall contents. And plant cells differ from animal cells in that they have cellulose within the cell wall, which is critical for that rigidity. So plants could not maintain the rigidity they have without the cellulose. And in addition, they have a vacuole, which is essentially a water-filled vessel in the middle that helps to maintain pressure within the cell. Other thing to remember, though, is that plants also have mitochondria. So just as we have mitochondria, plants do too. In addition to producing oxygen and converting CO2 to oxygen, they also consume oxygen in respiration. So every living plant cell has to consume oxygen and sugars in order to power the cell. We're just extremely fortunate that plants overproduce. They produce more oxygen than they consume, and they produce more sugars than they consume. So that's a key thing. And another thing to remember about that is that because plants they essentially have three sources of DNA, as where we as animals have nuclear DNA. So from the cell nucleus here and from the mitochondria, then we have mitochondrial DNA. Plants also have chloroplast DNA, which is another way of tracing plant lineages. So the other thing to remember is no matter where you are, water is present. And for most life, about 2/3 of the total mass of whatever organism you're looking at is composed of water. Now, it's actually more than that in terms of the molecules, because there's probably over 90% of the molecules of any given organism are water molecules, but the total weight or mass is really about 2/3 or so water. The other thing to remember is that plants have to overcome the challenges that come with all tissues that contain water. In this case, this is frost. This was actually taken locally. I know some years now we're not getting much frost, but this is a local picture of a soil heave associated with typical frost. And within cell tissues, plants have to overcome this frost and survive, obviously, no matter which plant it is. So the most important thing is that plant tissues, for plants that have to overcome frost, what they tend to do is ice crystals form. They can form within cells, but plants tend to pump water out of their cells during very cold seasons. And what they do that in order to prevent ice crystals from forming inside the cells. Because if it forms inside the cells, you can have tissue death, because those ice crystals can rupture the cell tissues. So plants tend to pump water between the cells during cold periods, and that's where the ice crystals typically form. And ironically, there's quite a bit of plant death after really cold periods, not from necessarily crystals forming and bursting tissue, but from the plant pumping so much water out of its cells that it dehydrates and it can't rehydrate. So there's two different ways that plants die in cold periods. And that dehydration is one that's commonly overlooked. So I wanted to talk real briefly about plants, because another aspect in which plants are really related to water in terms of how their life history works. This is a really simplistic diagram I created to show you kingdom Plantae. And it turns out that plants are divided between spore producers and seed producers. Now, on the far left over here, you've got green algae, which are plants. They don't form embryos, and they're very much aquatic organisms. Of your non-vascular plants, meaning mosses, liverworts, and algae, they also don't have tissue that moves water and nutrients up from the roots and sugars back down from the leaves. They have to rely on movement of those compounds between the different cells. So it's really important. But more simplistically, the production of spores and reliance on spores ties a plant to water in a way that seed-producing plants are not tied. So here's a bryophyte life history, and bryophytes are mosses and liverworts. So think about the moss that might grow in your lawn. And the key thing to remember in these spore-producing plants is that the thing you think of as the plant, like a moss, is here. That's the sporangium. But it produces spores, which then differentiate into what are called gametophytes. They're separate from that sporophyte. So every time you see a moss, remember, when it reproduces, a separate plants are actually, or multiple separate plants are being generated from spore tissue that then in turn produce additional spores and produce new embryos through recombination. But these are essentially, this is the diploid life form as you and I are, containing all the chromosomes. This is the haploid life form, the male and the female gametophytes, and they are recombined to produce an embryo to produce the next generation. But that's dependent upon the presence of water. These things, the sperm here are reliant on the presence of water. So when you see mosses to reproduce, they have to have water present. So do bryophytes. This is a picture from Massanutten. So obviously Massanutten, if you all familiar with it, is a mountain ridge line that's between the Blue Ridge and the Appalachians west of here. Not too far though. And the key thing is this is actually a seep system. So water's flowing out of the side of the mountain over a gravel bed. And you've got things like here, some jewelweed and some other things that are maybe recognizable. But at the base of this on the rocks, you've got these bryophytes. So you've got liverworts, which are really simplistic plants with no vascular tissue. And of course with mosses, which also don't have vascular tissue. And they're clinging to these rock surfaces where there's lots of water present. And it's an environment that probably resembles how they evolved coming out on land, where areas that were water rich. Another good shot of a liverwort. So ferns and their allies are also in that group of plants that produce spores. They actually have vascular tissue. So you think about things like club mosses and things like running cedar and ferns themselves, but they still have flagellated sperm and they require the presence of water to reproduce. So here's a club moss. Club moss is on the forest floor. This is up in the Appalachians in Washington County, Virginia. This area runs between 3,000 and 4,000 feet, so you're at higher elevation for Virginia. And this is a fairly typical scene on the forest floor. But times of the year, they have a lot of water presence they can reproduce. And this is shining club moss. So a fern life cycle looks very similar to a bryophyte life cycle. So you've got the sporophyte, which is this is the fern that we always think of. But then over here, you realize it produces the spores, and then it produces these gametophytes that in turn go through reproduction and produce an embryo that produces the next generation of sporophytes. So ferns are really relying again on the presence of water. These pictures are actually taken in Fairfax County in the Dogue Creek drainage. This is a really nice seepage wetland system that's in Dogue Creek Stream Valley. Cinnamon fern, and in this case, royal fern. And then these are horsetails or equisetum. These are, this is also called scouring rush. This is a fern ally. So it's a plant that has vascular tissue. Again, it's reliant on the presence of water for reproduction. And this is actually taken in the Appalachians, but this is the larger of our native scouring rushes or horsetails. This is the reproductive sporophyte, but these things are found everywhere. And this is actually growing out of a man-made stone wall. And you can see the reproductive body here producing the spores. And here's mosses and liverworts in that same wall. This is actually at Machu Picchu in Peru. So in the cloud forest. So these liverworts, mosses, and ferns, which are spore producers requiring the presence of water, are found all around the earth. So that water defining plant communities is not necessarily dependent upon the latitude or the altitude. It really has a lot to do with the type of plant and its reproductive history. And then, of course, the climate. And Machu Picchu, if you've been fortunate enough to go there, is actually located in a cloud forest. So it's on the eastern slope of the Andes approaching the Amazon. So it's at a mid-level elevation, and it relies then on, it has a tremendous amount of moisture. When you go there, it's an amazing place if you have the opportunity to go. So the other thing to think about is the presence of water in soils, which is the way we normally think about water with plants. And the important thing to remember is that plants rely on the presence of water, obviously, to pull them up through their roots. When it rains and we get a lot of rainfall or we have wetlands, we get saturated soil conditions. So we've got water just filling all the void spaces in the soil up to the top. Now, when that rain stops and that event, the event ends, over time, that water drains out of the soil profile through gravity. But what's left behind is what's called capillary water. That's the water between the grains of soil that's available for plants to take up. When it gets really dry, you lose all the capillary water. Then you have what's called hygroscopic water. That water's clinging tightly to the soils. So in order for plants to uptake water, you have to have capillary water present. By the time you get to the hygroscopic water stage, the water, even in a desert, there's hygroscopic water, but it's so tightly bound to the soil particles that plants can't take it up. So this whole cycle of the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle is so important for the cycling of water, obviously through evaporation. Also, remember, it's evapotranspiration because plants are taking this up and pushing it out through the leaves and then cycling that back into the atmosphere. And that transpiration process is really critical. This on the left shows you mycorrhizal fungi with a plant root, because the fungi actually will help, they'll assist in the uptake of the water and the nutrients. And then this available water space was in the water table and roots reaching down to take it up. And then the actual process of transpiration is pretty amazing because the roots in the plant create a differential where there's less water inside, more water outside. So it uses osmotic processes to pull water into the roots. And then as it moves up through the xylem, up through the plant, the conductive tissue for water going usually up, it relies on adhesion and cohesion where those water molecules, they actually cling to the sides of the cell wall, but they also cling to each other somewhat. And they move up through that cell tissue. And then finally at the top on the leaf, again, there's a pressure gradient where that leaf is releasing water to the atmosphere. And in the process, it also is pulling more water up to itself. So it's an amazing process through transpiration. Remember, transpiration is not photosynthesis. It's merely the process of pulling water from the soils up through the plant tissues and out through the leaves. Now, plants play critical roles. This is a picture from the Indian Ocean basin from the massive tsunami that hit a number of years ago. And it shows what happened after the tsunami. And what's been shown worldwide is the removal of mangrove forests and other barrier plant systems along coastal areas is tremendously impactful in terms of removing the ability of that system both to protect these soil areas and the shorelines from the impacts of large weather events, but also the recovery, because you can see how devastating this was in terms of removing all this vegetation and clearly a massive loss of human life in these communities that were located there. This picture is taken in Cape May, New Jersey, and it's a salt marsh system. And I think what's amazing is, and I'll go back one step, I was fortunate. I've been fortunate enough for years to be able to go to Cape May and help out with raptor banding during the fall migration. And it's such a wonderfully explicit example of the biosphere. So essentially, below the bottom of this marsh and up to the top of those trees is pretty much the biosphere. So life on Earth for the terrestrial systems is pretty much contained within this thin layer of plant communities that exists within the soils and up into the air. And it doesn't go much higher and it doesn't go much lower. And that's pretty much the definition. And then you see how within margins, these plants have different spatial distribution, some more terrestrial, some more aquatic or marine. And here's the tidal gut itself, and just seeing how water moves through the system and is defining those tidal systems. This is Spartina grass, which most of you may be familiar with. There are about 3 species of Spartina in Virginia, different sizes that they live in different portions of the salt marsh systems. And they're critical species for anchoring that marsh and providing not only holding the soils, but also a significant percentage of the animal species are associated with these plants. So wetlands is something I think we all kind of understand. So it's a saturated condition. And then the big issue is what does that really mean? So when you see a wetland, what types of wetlands are there? And we think of it logically as being these saturated zones near water bodies or places where the groundwater table is very high. Now, wetlands can appear actually up on the sides of hills. I was fortunate enough to work with the Arlington Master Naturalists in the last few weeks and take a tour of the marsh, or excuse me, the bog at 4 Mile Run. And that bog is a really good example of a system where you have clay layers interbedded with gravel and sand cobble layers, and water's flowing through these side areas and popping out on the hillsides as well as down at the bottom of the slope. That's the Barcroft bog. So these hydric soils are a defining factor of wetland systems. And these particular soils are examples within freshwater systems. But you can see it's low oxygen, so you get these grade soils. You get a peaty kind of condition here, the accumulation because it's the low oxygen content. So in terms of plants being adapted for these systems, I'm going to start out with the saltwater systems. And you think about the need to be able to keep your tissues alive when there's high salt concentrations. So these plants can tolerate these high salt concentrations, and they are able to keep the salt content lower inside their tissues by actually secreting a lot of it. And they have fleshy leaves, so they are able to kind of shed some of that salt and store water within their tissues, which is really important. This is an example of very salt tolerant shrub species, and it's interesting. So this is, if you aren't familiar with this, is Baccharis or groundsel. And this is a species that's dioecious, meaning that it has separate flowers for the different sexes. In some cases, dioecious plants, it's on the same plant. In some cases, it's on a separate plant. And this happens to be on a separate plant. In flowering plants, that's not quite as common. But in this case, the male is actually the showier of the two. It's the white flowers, and the female is the yellow flowers. This is seaside aster. So this is one of the composites that's got the fleshy leaves, and it's adapted to these very salty conditions. Very common in the coastal plain of Virginia. This is another good shot of a Spartina marsh. And then, of course, these marshes are actually highly productive. This is a northern harrier caught during the migration period, and peregrine falcons. So these birds are hunting the marsh systems looking for prey during the migratory period. These are all birds caught under the Cape May banding program. So they're caught and then banded and measured and released. This is the oldest raptor banding program, I believe, in North America. So these Spartina marshes and these saltwater marshes are widespread. This is an example at Virginia Beach. This is at Broad Bay. There's actually 2 species here. On the right is the lower marsh. It's actually more in the tidal zone. And this is a little bit, this is the intermediate marsh over here. And you can see the two species interbed really nicely, and they form tremendous barrier and hold soils. And you've got these bivalves that are clinging to the roots. So clams, they're actually clinging to the roots of these plants, and they're out at high tide. They're actually exposed. Excuse me, at low tide, they're exposed to the air, and at high tide, they're underwater again. And then there's more of this by Tyner Marsh. This is a crab burrow. Here's a little fiddler, hermit crab. And then that's glass shrimp. And this is comb jelly. So these are really common. All species are found in this estuary. And these are actually Atlantic menhaden. This is the species that, of course, has been exploited in very, very high numbers for protein sources. It is really the backbone of much of the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem. Of course, there's other species that can claim that, like oysters and others and crabs, but menhaden in terms of a prey species and a primary consumer is extremely important. And they actually spend a lot of their time as young fish in these marshes among the plants. So this is another example of a similar system. So this one has Spartina in the front and it has black needle rush in the back. This is actually at Bethel Beach down near Matthews, Virginia. You get these barrier islands that host quite a few bird species. This is one of the barrier islands. This is a seaside dasher, or it's a dragonfly that's endemic to that area. This is a hairy-necked tiger beetle, which is a relatively common tiger beetle that's on these systems. And this is actually a federally endangered, this is a northeastern beach tiger beetle, and it's really dependent upon these barrier systems. It's only found in a few places in the Chesapeake Bay and in coastal systems northeast of here. So this is an example. These are pictures that were taken on Labor Day this year. So this is these coastal systems with these plants that are adapted to these high salt conditions, and the plants actually are the thing that holds together these barrier island systems. So it's critical for the survival of these species to have these barrier islands and the plants that can survive there. So some of the other things plants do in order to survive in aquatic conditions, they have to pump oxygen down to their roots, because remember, every living plant cell has to breathe. So just as your cells have to breathe, plant cells have to breathe. And we often forget that, whether it's a tree growing in your yard or a grass growing in a marsh, they have to pump oxygen to those living tissues so they can respire and actually go through their normal metabolic processes. And in doing so, they create these really unique little ecosystems around their roots where there's a little bit higher oxygen content. There are root exudates from the plant itself, and there's a lot more life around the root systems of these plants within these marsh and wetland systems than there is in the surrounding water. Just an example of them pumping oxygen down to their roots. This is a picture down from Peru again. This is in the Amazon in Peru. This is Puerto Maldonado area, Lado de Sandoval, which is a very well-known natural area that's a cutoff meander of the Madre de Dios River. It actually has giant river otters and other really interesting species. The tall plants here are moriche palms that actually produce edible fruits or seeds that are harvested by native peoples and eaten by many animals. And they survive, but the plants are about 30 meters or 90 plus feet tall, but their roots will run out for 40 meters, over 120 feet, in order to keep those plants up within that marsh system. There's a bit of the fruits there. This picture is from First Landing State Park here in Virginia. And you see the buttressed root systems. These are not cypress. These are actually mostly different species of tupelo. We think of black gum in our area, Nyssa sylvatica. Well, there's 3 species of Nyssa down in the coastal plain area, Nyssa aquatica and one other. And this one I think is aquatica, but see that buttressed root system, and those roots have to breathe during this. It's a black water system, mostly fresh, because remember, it's got salt water on both sides. It's on a barrier island here, but this is mostly a freshwater system. And then along our rivers, this is actually, I believe, on the Occoquan Reservoir. And you can see the tidal flats when things are coming out of the water here, pickerel weed, and tremendous. And then of course, crimson-eyed mallow or marshmallow. And so many insects that are dependent upon these plants. It's Virginia dayflower. And then, of course, we have many shrub systems too. This is turtlehead, one of our wonderful native wetland species that grows in often forested conditions, sometimes emergent marshes. And there's lizard tail, cardinal flower, and frogbit, which is a wonderful little plant that you'll find intertwined along the edges, often the forested edges of these wetland systems. This is a wetland that's in Fairfax County. It's actually probably the largest seepage wetland system. This is the creek, obviously, so this isn't the seepage part. But there's a massive seepage wetland system that's just kind of by happenstance missed development. And this system is really rich. This is kind of the edge of it. What you might call this upper area would be the small stream forest that has things such as tulip poplar and also fern species like New York fern, but then it grades into the wetlands where the saturated soils are, and you get many sedges and things. And this is actually a picture of a similar system. That one previous is actually a seep-driven system, so the water seeping out of the ground from the layers. It's coming from the upland. This is actually a riparian system in Mott's Run Reservoir in Spotsylvania County, where you've got an impounded area and the stream is backed up and it fills in this void space right here. And you've got this really beautiful forested wetland dominated by lizard tail. Then you get to our tidal marshes, as you guys are familiar with as Friends of Dyke Marsh. This is actually a picture. These next series of pictures are taken on the Occoquan River at Old Colchester Park and Preserve, which is a Fairfax County park. And it's actually located here. This is the Route 1 bridge, that's I-95. So this is Old Colchester Park and Preserve. This is a picture of a state rare plant. This is river bulrush. And it's interbedded here with cattails. This is a picture of the kind of the gut. This is the bridge up here, this railroad bridge and the Route 1 bridge off to the left. River bulrush. Raccoons like to poop on logs. There's a nice latrine log there where they've been eating lots of seeds, and they like to haul out to a dry spot to poop. And there's looking up into the marsh. Of course, it's wild rice. This is an invasive species of many of our aquatic systems. This is Merdania kaisic. Different names to it, water willow moving herb or something like that, some complicated names. But it's really an aggressive invasive. It's now found in every aquatic system in our region. This is wonderful. This is Helenium autumnale, or small fall sneezeweed. And of course, these are the hips of swamp rose. Then you get swamp indigo bush, which you can find frequently in Dyke Marsh. And then Virginia dayflower again. There's pickerel weed. Now, we also get some interesting grasses. This one's actually called Iconocloa muricata. It's swamp barnyard grass. It's the wet version, the native version. There's also one that's not native called Iconocloa cruzgali. And this is actually cruzgali on the left. There's 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2 species right there. And then in the marsh itself, this is the third species. It's the unusual one. It's called Iconocloa waltersryi, or Walter's millet. This picture is at Old Colchester Park and Preserve, but I recently found a small population on Little Hunting Creek. So it is within the tidal systems in our area. Again, Walter's millet. Very hairy looking. This picture is at Dyke Marsh itself. So this is a swamp forest. This is obviously before the emerald ash borer arrived. This is actually when we were doing a number of years back. I think it's about 2012 at the latest. We were doing a herp survey that the National Park Service organized. A bunch of us were walking in these systems. This is just, you can see the pumpkin ash as the dominant overstory. And there's some of that is resprouting now. I know there's some folks looking at that in terms of the survivability of pumpkin ash. So in terms of our systems, This is a similar system. This is also tidal marsh. This is at Caledon State Park on the Potomac River downstream of Dyke Marsh. This is right as the river is grading from freshwater to a low salinity brackish system, but all the same species are pretty much present. Let's see if this actually works here. So you can see this is the water flowing out at low tide, and it's amazing the water transfer between that. This is the marsh. This is the barrier island system between the marsh and the main river. And there's so much water transfer twice a day. It's amazing the amount of current and the flow between the freshwater marsh system and the surrounding and the adjacent river system. And watch as it comes out, it's emptying into the river, and it's coming with such force that you can see this mixing zone that occurs right down here. So that's just a tremendous amount of water pouring out of the marsh system. And again, that's what you got to remember is going on at Dyke Marsh twice a day. So it's really important for these tidal systems. And then this is at Leesylvania State Park. This is a scene in the fall where you see that wonderful kind of congregation of marsh plants. Autumn sneezeweed again. This is the cardinal flower. This is American groundnut. And then you've got Virginia dayflower. Now pay attention to the autumn sneezeweed here because it's actually a common species. But remember, there's also marsh plants and wetland adapted plants that are very uncommon. So on the lower right, you've got the map from the Digital Atlas of Virginia Flora showing autumn sneezeweed. It's found in almost every county in Virginia, incredibly common native of wetland systems. On the left, you've got Helenium virginicum, which is a federally endangered plant that only occurs in 6 counties in the United States, 3 of them in Virginia. So it's amazing to think about 2 plants that look very alike in the same genus that have very specifically different habitat needs that cause one to be super common and one to be federally endangered. And this is a map by USDA from USDA Plant showing the distribution of Helenium virginicum. And that's the Virginia one, which is we just saw is only 3 counties here. And the only place it's found is in Missouri. So in Virginia, it's found in George Washington National Forest. This is the west slope near Waynesboro. They've got these amazing pond systems that occur. These are ancient deposits that fell off the mountain slopes, and they fill up with water in seasonal ponds multiple times per year. So this is the floor of one of those ponds in the fall, and the Virginia sneezeweed is there. And again, this is the same genus as autumn sneezeweed and looks very much like it, but because of its habitat needs, it's a federally endangered plant. This is back at Huntley Meadows. So here you've got an example of coastal plain depression swamp forest, where you've got these wonderful flatwoods that are just extensive at Huntley Meadows, and an example of what was here at one time in the past. They're full of wetland species, and this is the leaf out in the spring of a black gum growing on the edge of one of these swamp forests in Huntley Meadows. This particular frame here is actually along a river system. So here you've got a bar in a river. This is actually the Shenandoah River, but this also I've found in every stream system in our region, whether it's at Quantico Creek or Bull Run, you can find this. And this is water willow or Justicia americana. It's also found at Dyke Marsh and the tidal marsh. But this is an incredibly common plant that is an indicator species of these bar systems within streams and river systems in our region. And this is a picture from Eleanor C. Lawrence Park in Big Rocky Run. And what this shows is this is a geologically unique area. It's got this thermally metamorphosed sandstone. But unlike the incised creeks in our area, the hard rock has kept the stream shallow and wide. And these are all sycamores, and they're holding these islands together. And sycamores are indicative if you're on the Potomac River, on the upstream area above the fall line, or whether you're in the Shenandoah or here in Big Rocky Run, you've got sycamores on what are called rock bar island communities. And these, again, are wetland associated communities that are very dry between rain events, but they go underwater frequently. So taking a little bit further afield, thinking about bog systems. So bogs are very unique. places where you have tremendous amounts of water. It's very perched. This is at Dolly Sods in West Virginia. If you haven't been there, it's a tremendous place. This is one of the interpretive signs they have in this really nice little walking loop that shows some of these bog plants, these high acid systems. So it's high acidity, low oxygen, and it's wet as can be. This is the boardwalk just past the sign looking out over top of a bog. And within that bog, you've got sphagnum moss, sundews, which are carnivorous plants, and this is cranberry, and growing all together in this saturated acidic system. Here's another shot of the sphagnum moss turning color for the fall, and then the sundews on top of it. And then there are also many orchid species that occur there as a result of this unique system. And then gentians. So incredible plants that are growing in these really limiting conditions. They have low nutrients, low acidity, and often difficult conditions, but it does lower the competition. So these plants are adapted to living in these conditions. Just another thought about what plants do to get by in these aquatic systems. In this case, you've got Huntsman Lake in Fairfax. This is when it was drawn down a number of years ago for maintenance. And what happened was the lake was drawn down, and then the seed bed just erupted. So you had this area had been underwater for 38 years. No telling when individual seeds arrived, but seeds can survive for long periods of time in waters that are lower in oxygen, and of course in water itself. So in this case, you had a bunch of plants just erupt out of the seed bed in the bottom of that lake. Lots of knotweeds, and then this is Lycopus or bugle. So, and then solidagos too. So lots of plants that adapted. We also often think of floodplain systems. In this case, you've got these alluvial systems with lots of deposited material outside of the stream in areas that seasonally flood. So our classic bluebells. This is at Hemlock Overlook in Fairfax County. And you've got dwarf ginseng. And of course, Virginia Spring Beauty. And then we've got pawpaw, which in this case, you've got both ants and flies pollinating this. And this is a familiar face, Alan Ford. This is walking along the Potomac River. This is actually a massive pawpaw at Madeira School property, one of the largest ones any of us have ever seen. And then along those side slope areas, you'll get things like rattlesnake hawkweed, just in a little bit drier condition. Now, grasslands also are defined often by water. These pictures are taken in the deep cut area of Manassas Battlefield. So you've got areas within that system that are actually much wetter and some areas that are drier. This is just Indian grass in bloom. And here you've got a Lespedeza, native Lespedeza. And a Bidens of sorts, or sunflower. And then you've got one of your eupatoriums or bone sets here. Same thing. But again, the water does define the system. The meadow systems are often quite dry during certain times of the year and often wet in other times of the year. And then of course, there's most of these systems, the grass dominant systems, are also fire dependent in terms of their how those systems behave. Purple milkweed here. And tiger beetles again. Nice theme there. This is the 6-spotted, our common one. And then these plants are reaching really deep into the soils to find water. So one of the things that is these pictures were drawn in the early 1900s by a couple different folks, and they're looking at prairie systems in the Midwest. But what they found when they excavated down was these prairie systems had developed over 10,000 years or so, and a lot of the soils there were from the remains of glaciation. Some of it was glaciated material that was moved, and some of it was loess, or the dust that's blown out from the glaciers and deposited. And then you had these grass systems that established themselves on them. And grasses put tremendous amounts of carbon in the soil. They put more carbon in the soil than trees do, because trees hold a lot of their carbon in the actual tree tissue, as where grasses are pumping that carbon into their root systems. So they put tremendous amounts of carbon into the soil, and that's what built the prairie soils up to 20 feet deep of this carbon-rich soil profile. So we also, of course, have adaptation for dry conditions. Now, this photo is taken in Arizona near Tucson earlier this year, and it's really close to Saguaro National Park. So you have saguaro cactuses and ocotillo, which are these really slender-looking cacti out here, and of course prickly pear and a bunch of other plants. But the spatial distribution of these plants, which is, oops, excuse me, it's amazing to see. If you see these patches, water is defining these plant systems. And the same thing happens all over Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. When you go into these, even where there's coniferous forests, the distribution of the plants is often defined by the amount of water. So here you've got these really dry uplands with saguaro cactus, what's called forest, and they are spaced so that they can exploit water resources, but they're not directly competing, because obviously over time one will outcompete the other if there's limited water, which obviously there is. So the spatial distribution of plants in deserts is defined by the availability of water. This is a shot at Saguaro National Park close to sunset. And of course, if you've not been to the Sonoran Desert, I would suggest, personally, I've fallen in love with it, and it's just full of really diverse life forms. So this is javelina, or collared peccary, which I've heard different things, but quite honestly, to me, I can't think of anything but a pig. Supposedly they're closer related to elephants, but anyway. They act like a pig, they snort like a pig, they have a snout like a pig. But javelinas are amazing, and they're really adaptive. White-winged dove, beautiful, and they're super abundant, as are the mourning dove is also super abundant out there. This is a picture of a roadrunner having caught a desert mouse. Actually, they're amazing. This one, I was fortunate to get this shot, but it went into this grass, and I thought it was going after this lizard, which spurted out, but it came out with a mouse and killed it. So this is an amazing bird, very much like a little tiny dinosaur. Here at Joshua Tree National Park, you've got these similarly an amazing diversity of plant life and animal life, but again, the distribution is often dictated by the water. Here's creosote, which is super common throughout the West. It's actually a pea family member, as many of the shrubs are out there. But this is an interpretive sign. They talk about this, says that creosote roots can grow as deep as 60 feet, searching for water deep within the soil profile. So 60 feet. So again, water is defining these plants, how they grow in relationship to one another, and how they've evolved to exploit the available resources. This is a cholla cactus. And what was really cool is we found these all over, whether it's in Arizona, whether it's in California, whether it's in Utah. You find these cholla cactuses, and commonly, pay attention to this little area right here, you can find nests. So this is a black-throated sparrow on nest in a cholla cactus in Joshua Tree National Park. So just to give another example of, if you add water, you can change the face of the system. In eastern Utah, along Route 70, which you haven't driven Route 70, it is an amazing drive. And we ended up, my daughter and I earlier this year drove it from Missouri all the way through Kansas, across Colorado, and into Utah for peeling off. So you get to see a lot of the country there. But eastern Utah is very desert-like. You can see how dry it is. But this little area right here is a rest stop, and it is a little oasis. So you've got the surrounding desert. It's extremely dry, very low plant density and diversity. And then you've got this little oasis, which they've planted native plants along with some turf to give people a taste of not only a little rest area, obviously they're irrigating it, but also a taste of the plant life in Utah. So here's what it looks like. Clearly there's some turf there. Many of the plantings are native. Here's western kingbird, and they actually were nesting. So you build this little oasis, and suddenly kingbirds show up. And then they had Palmer's penstemon, which is extremely widespread plant, growing over several states in that region, and you can find it in many places. And here you go, a western bumblebee. This is a species that was declining. It's a very large bumblebee, but it's now making a rebound. But the interesting thing is, how did this bee find this little oasis with a blooming Palmer's penstemon in the middle of this desert, many, many, many miles from any other water source? And then I actually had a little experience here. I was looking at the lawn area. Here's a lark sparrow, which is one that I'd never seen before. But again, it found this little oasis. So thinking about these areas that are impacted by water, this is a slightly different look. This is Channels Natural Area Preserve in Washington County, Virginia. As you're walking up to it, you pass a bunch of seep systems. We saw this picture before. But then you get these incredible views on top of the mountain looking around. This is all Western Virginia, Southwestern Virginia. Looking west here, I think, or northwest toward the valley that goes back towards Richlands. And this is just a slight barren with a bunch of rhododendron on top. And here's a true barren, a rock barren or a rock outcrop. Very quiet. I had one of the quietest days of my life up there. And then you go through this rhododendron covered area and you come into what is a rock carved canyon system that's sitting on top of this mountain. It's truly a wonderful spot. Again, a natural area preserve. You've got all these plants clinging to surfaces, lichens also. And then you have this water carved rock system, many thousands of years old, sitting on top of a ridge at almost 4,000 feet. So it's a very unique site and one definitely worth going to. It's a really nice hike. And as you can see, I got there in late spring, so there's still some snow hanging out. So it was a low visitation day. Gettysburg National Battlefield Park, similarly, you don't think of it as a place for good plants, but actually has wonderful biota. And in this case, you've got lots of rock outcrops with perched water table. You have naturally occurring species that are interesting, some more Western species, but also things like American bladdernut, which is common in the mountains and in some river systems around here. It's found in Fairfax County in certain systems, but you've got a pretty high shrub diversity and very high grass diversity, but a lot of it's more reflective of a more wetland type system. So the other thing to think about is the impact of wetland systems that's going on by the disruption. And we all have heard over the years about loss of wetlands around the world. This picture is from NASA showing a composite of nighttime across the Earth. You can see how the Northern Hemisphere is so impacted by human activity and development, and as is part of the Southern Hemisphere. And this is just a graphic that shows that of the remaining vertebrates on Earth, very little is wild. These little green dots are what things that are wild, and the rest is all us and our livestock. And then another way to look at it is that as of 2018, the National Academy of Sciences estimated this is the total mass of life on Earth. This is the plant life. Now, they feel that likely the plant biomass is half of what it used to be several hundred years ago. So the ability of the Earth to support life is largely dependent upon plants because they have to transfer energy to all the other things. So the fact that we have half of what we used to have, and then a lot of that's been converted to human crops, means that you can't support that much in terms of wildlife. It's all been degraded and divided up. Then of the remaining amount of, you've got all this here, bacteria, fungi, archaea, protists, and over here are the other animals. So when you look at that breakdown, you get us, you get arthropods, fish, mollusks, annelids, our livestock, and then you get nematodes, and over here are the wild vertebrates, tiny little fraction. So it's just an example. And this is just a graph demonstrating that. And then the climate change, in addition, is these are just a graphic from UC Berkeley showing the impacted ecosystems that are vulnerable due to climate change. We don't always think of our common landscapes. This is the Shenandoah Valley. I always thought of it as a beautiful landscape, bucolic, but it is biologically impoverished. This is all mostly non-native species with a lot of invasives that have been converted to agriculture and increasingly overrun with things like autumn olive and Johnson grass. And the native stuff's been pushed to the periphery. And then you've got white-tailed deer eating out most of the understory all within these areas. So you've got a tremendous impact, these natural systems. This is an example of where we don't do good inventory before we go and disturb land. This is Silver Lake Park in western Prince William County. The park is over here. This ended up being dedicated to the school systems. They found wetlands. They kind of carved that out, but what they did not identify is this is a globally rare plant community that they put ball fields on. We tried to get them to switch and put the ball fields here, but the schools would have none of it, even though all the other parties, including the public works, were willing to switch it. So this is the globally rare plant community. This is also globally rare community. This is a wetland system, but this is the upland counterpart. This is the wetland system. It's a diabase upland depression swamp forest. So it's in the Piedmont on igneous rock. And this is the upland counterpart. This is the northern hardpan basic oak hickory forest. Just as rare, very susceptible to impact, very grass dominant in the understory. And because the soils are relatively impoverished, you have very low tree heights. The trees are very old given their diameter. They're much older than a tree of a similar diameter from a richer system. So you get a lot of light penetration, which allows that grass to grow in the understory. There's just a rattlesnake plantain, which is, of course, an orchid. And yellow stargrass. And this is four-leaf milkweed, which is found in high numbers in these systems when they're not overly browsed by deer. So another thing to think about is the imperviousness. So as we develop areas, we take away the native plant cover in the soils, and the water runs off and it can't recharge the groundwater. So we lose the recharge for our streams, but also for our wetland systems. So this is our typical development with lots of, even the lawn areas are heavily compacted. We take off all that good topsoil. This is a thin skim coat layer after 38 years. This is actually on a dam, but when you have compacted soils, that turf only penetrates down this far. I've been seeing a lot of presentations recently on the benefits of that, relieving that compaction, the ability to hold water. You can hold 17,000 to 25,000 gallons of water for every 1% increase in organic material in the soil. That's per acre. So by relieving compaction and letting those grasses put their root systems deeper, you can massively increase the amount of water that can be uptaken by this. You not only hold it on the landscape, a lot of it can then infiltrate, but also it's available for healthier systems, even if it's turf. Here's just a kind of a simple little stormwater pond that's got some wetland function going on in a typical roadside. And then this is actually in California. They did a similar thing out there. Same thing. This is in north of LA, out in the desert, east of the ridge lines. And they've got the same kind of stormwater basins for whenever it rains. So the other thing we do is our concept of what's native is really skewed. This is an ad for a resort in Fauquier County, and nothing in the picture is native. So you don't have any native plants. So there's nothing being fostered by this. And probably the soils are pretty compacted under that lawn. This kind of just shows you in Northern Virginia, actually this is Fairfax, but the remaining kind of green spaces, there are private lands that aren't developed, but you can see the island effect, all the fragmentation that's caused by our development patterns. This is in Western Fairfax, a house that was allowed to be built on top of a creek. And this is in Tysons. This is part of Scotts Run, running underneath Dolly Madison Boulevard, Route 123. And this is Accotink Creek after a large storm event. You can see how torn up the banks are from all that runoff. And then, of course, we compound everything by having way too many white-tailed deer. These deer are living in Tysons. This was a herd of 13 eating everything in their path that's native. So I guess the big message here I was trying to come up with is the thought that we all do have a role in going forward. The choices by our forebears and our contemporaries have caused the current condition in terms of degraded systems. So really we need to make choices that are better. So on the left, you have the negative choices, which have led to where we are. On the right are some options maybe for more positive choices that can help heal systems and put native plants back and let water be captured in the landscape and recharge this groundwater tables and make it available for life. This is kind of an interesting thought. This was in Galax, Virginia. It was out in this farm field, and it would look like a pretty desolate spot, but there was a nearby spring. And as the sun went down, this is a slender winter stonefly. So what's interesting was, even though I was in an upland area, you had a seepage system that was nearby in a small creek, and the stoneflies were emerging out of that small creek. So even where you have systems that may look like they don't have as much life, there are often remnants that you can draw on to help build or rebuild systems. Thinking about wetlands, this is a vernal pool system in Fairfax County. And everybody thinks about the pool itself, but the pool is just the breeding area. It's the forest around it that provides the habitat for the adults and the juveniles that emerge from the pools. So when you think about the adults breeding and you think about egg masses, which is everybody thinks about vernal pools, what you really should be thinking about is this envelope up to 750 feet or more around each vernal pool that needs to be protected in order to protect the majority of that breeding population. Because once they leave the pool, they're living in the forest. All these organisms, all these amphibians are living in the forest, leaf litter and underground, and they only go to that pool to breed. So this is the part you have to save. And if you don't save it, you can't save what's the purpose of the pool. You might compromise its hydrology, but you'll also take away the breeding population. So these upland systems here are not only feeding the pool, there's where a lot of the organisms are living. And of course, there's a tadpole. And then, of course, they are in turn recharging groundwater. So when you get flow in these headwater streams that are really healthy, look at this, low banks, nice low flow. This is after a storm event. Then they get to the larger systems and you see some torn up banks, but they're still in good shape. This is a wetland system. This is actually in Prince William County, where you actually got beaver active. So where you can allow these natural processes to occur, like at Huntley Meadows, or in this case, it's the Cedar Run Wetland Bank. But that's where if we can allow those to occur and allow beaver to have a role in the landscape, they can assist. This is an example of a project that we worked with the Friends of Dyke Marsh on. This is the outfall at Quander Road Park. This is Dyke Marsh. This is the part by River Towers. And this is Mount Vernon District Park. So what we found is that this little tiny drainage area was causing massive erosion in Mount Vernon District Park. That little pipe right there was spewing out water that created this massive gully. This is a 36-inch diameter tree, and you can see the hole that it created down through here. So we worked with a bunch of partners to come in here and restore it. This is the downstream end, some of the seepage wetlands that some of them were being dewatered further up on the slope. But we restored it, and this is a picture I took earlier this year that shows the healing system and those seepage wetlands. So we were able to actually put it back and create a stabilized system with minimal impact in this case, because we were able to work within an area that had been previously disturbed for most of our footprint. And just, kind of restoring the processes to the wetland like we did at Quander Road is really a fortunate thing. We can put back the hydrology as well as provide the plants, or the foundation for the plants to thrive. This is an example in Lincolnia. So this is Fairfax County near, it's between Alexandria and very close to Green Spring Gardens. You've got this seepage wetland system that's clung to life, partly on parkland and partly on private land. And you can see this flow coming out of the hillside. That's base flow from a seep. That's where the creek starts. So you've got this wonderful gravel dominant system. This is a restored stream. This is at Fairfax County Government Center. We're able to come in along a trail and sewer line and minimize the tree impacts. And then not only were we able to do that, but on this downstream end, there was a remaining seepage wetland system. And by putting in these cutoff walls here to prevent erosion, we were able to keep the hydrology intact within that seepage wetland. So you've got these tremendous diversity of ferns and sedges and other wetland plants that were already there and were able to maintain their hydrology. One of the other things we can do is increasingly try to make better systems for the uplands. So this is at UVA. Their architectural school is really good at looking at their grounds. And even though this is a very formal area, this is actually an area that collects water. And then they've got these breaks that actually shed water into these vegetated swales. This is an example at Sherwood Hall uh, Library in Mount Vernon. So very close. This is actually in the Little Hunting Creek drainage. And this is Gettysburg National Battlefield Park, where you've got these vegetated swales in between the parking lot bays that capture that water and try to hold it and let it infiltrate. Here's an example of an old pond in Fairfax County that was, it was an old, what they call a peak shaver pond, a dry pond. Very little water was held in it. And this is very overgrown. This is off of Guinea Road. So there was an area here that was a really degraded kind of pine stand that was cleared because we also had to spread the soils from inside rather than hauling them off site. And that's another part of the site that was changed. That's where it was replanted. This is near the pond area, and that's where it was also reshaped, so it has a wetland system in it. And this is 2 years ago, so that system it had Phragmites in it when we started, and a lot was being overrun by a number of invasive species. Now it's doing quite well. This is the upland that's developing on the back end in the aftermath of the pine stand that was full of invasive species. And it's not always successful that way. The key thing is trying to pick which sites lend themselves to restoration where you can provide an improvement versus having a negative impact on an intact system. This is a early stream restoration project in Fairfax County in the Kingstown area. And this is coming down. You see that system kind of regrowing there. One of the keys to this is the adjacent side slope forest system is very good quality. And that's where your parent material and kind of your intact system is. The bottom was really degraded, but this is a really high value system adjacent to that stream system. Another thing is beginning to question how we look at streams in terms of whether or not we do work. We often look at streams and think that they're highly degraded, but we need to think more about, is this just a stage in its evolution? And if we come in here, will the impact of doing work be greater than the impact that the stream is going to have while it goes through its evolution? And meanwhile, is it providing services that are valuable? And there's often a gradation. In some cases, this system might be going and become much worse over time. But here's an example in Fairfax and the Great Falls area where you have a very stable system. Somebody was proposing to move as part of a private development that was ultimately denied. And this stream is in very good shape with very connected banks. These underroot areas provide a lot of habitat. So this is a really important part of how that system functions. Quick examples here as I wind down this, because I know we want to get to some questions too. Huntley Meadows Park, when it did the wetland restoration. If those of you who aren't familiar, Huntley Meadows had an antenna array field run by the Department of the Navy in the mid-20th century during the Cold War. Once that was abandoned, beavers moved in and began flooding it. By the 90s and early 2000s, we called that kind of the rabbit. It was underwater for about 2 decades with the beaver activity, and then the beavers had eaten a lot of their food. Part of it they also killed by keeping the water high, and then we also had tremendous inflow of sediment from development up here that filled in parts of the wetland. And then you started having the beavers move around, abandon their dams, and you got drought periods. So it was decided to restore the wetland, and there were a number of goals, but a lot of it had to do with controlling water so that we could manipulate the water levels to provide habitat for wildlife. So this was a heavy build project involving putting in a vinyl sheet pile wall and building a big berm. And the ultimate outcome, and we also provided pools that were refugia during drought times for wildlife that can't handle pure drought. The big thing was managing the water level. So here's when you manage the water at the low level, and here's what it would look like when you bring that water level up. And the idea is that you let it rise during the fall and you flood it, and then you provide habitat in the wintertime that's for floaters, so mostly ducks. And by letting it drain down during the summertime, you grow plants, which then produce the food for the ducks. Then conversely, you let it drain down slowly towards the spring. And by the time you get your wading birds in, they're in a lower water level, but you have a lot of crayfish production. So you keep cycling it between the lower volume late summer and then the full condition in the winter. And this is what it looks like today, obviously. And then we talked a little bit about the coastal plain depression swamp forests. Move on through that. This is kind of a cool shot here of a Fowler's toad. And this is a eastern hognose snake we saw at Huntley Meadows one day walking through, and they specialize in eating toads. So we talked a bit before about the hydrologic cycle and soils. This is a project that was done at Wolf Trap National Park, and they took that big bowl that was outside of the system and they built a really cool meadow area that's kind of a exemplar now of a public space that provides not only beauty but also ecological benefit. In thinking about not undervaluing the role of some of our most common species like broom sedge and Virginia pine and eastern red cedar, and converting our spaces more from those really bereft places to some of these older spaces where people actually allowed larger trees to grow and also use native plants in their landscaping. This is an example in Arlington. And then leaving these little remnants that can provide, again, benefits from wildlife and aesthetics, as well as holding water in places. This is a good example of moss in a natural area that could also be your lawn. And leaving all that woody debris, which builds those soils and holds that rainwater in place. Just thinking about that. And then, of course, there's also these other efforts to put more trees back in the landscape so that we can have more forested systems, which do a tremendous job of not only intercepting rainwater, but holding it and infiltrating it. So just thinking about that as we try to finish up here, the importance of these natural systems and mimicking them. And then these, what the results are in terms of how that water works in the landscape, forms those plant communities, and then kind of harbors life. So that's it for the presentation. That's the parting shot is near sundown at Saguaro National Park near Tucson. So I'll stop sharing here, I guess, and we'll open the floor up and let Deborah and Glenda take over control. We'll see what we do in terms of questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Charles. We do have the first question in the chat is actually from Glenda. And I don't know if you can see it or if you'd like me to read it to you.
Let me pull up the chat here real quick. So it says in Dyke Marsh, 80% of the plants we put in seem to be surviving. The area occasionally gets inundated during high tides and storms. Should we be concerned about that? Does the depletion of Virginia's eastern aquifer have serious implications for plants? And then controlling invasive species, that's another big thing. So two questions I would say. One is the issue of whether or not depletion of the aquifer has any impact on the survival of the plants, and then because they seem to be doing okay on high tides, and then the issue of invasives. So on the issue of freshwater and dike marsh, I wouldn't worry there. As of now, there's no indication that as sea levels rise, you'll get a higher concentration immediately of salt. Although salt from road application is increasing our local streams. But for now, it seems that dike marsh is probably one of those fortunate zones that has tremendously abundant water. And of course, over time, that sea level will rise. So the marsh will change. But for now, I wouldn't be concerned about that in terms of the eastern aquifer depletion. I don't think it's as applicable in eastern Fairfax as much because we're not as dependent upon groundwater sources, and particularly in dike marsh where you're looking at a tidal marsh system. The invasives control is a huge issue. I know there's been a lot of folks working on that within the volunteers as well as National Park Service. Unfortunately, I think that the biggest issue is trying to reduce the total biomass within a given area of the invasives and restore the natives so that they can establish a foothold and compete. If you can get the invasive biomass down and control the seed rain and get more native plants in and have more of a native seed rain, you can start to switch the balance a bit. I just think that the And I know that a lot of folks in the Friends of Dyke Marsh and the folks working with National Park Service have been in that battle for a number of years. It's been a tremendously important improvement in that zone. I know along the Hall Road, I would say just keep it up until you kind of tip the balance to where there's a lower overall biomass. It'll probably have that work there, but it is making a huge difference. And I think as you're getting those native plants in, slowly they'll begin to hold their own. Deer management at restoration sites is another one that's coming in. I think the key on deer management is you have to decide what you want to do. I know Arlington's been working to try to get toward deer management. Fairfax has been working on deer management, but it's not everywhere. So where deer are present, if you can reduce their numbers over time, that's really important to get fewer deer mouths out in the landscape. Where they are present and you can't reduce their numbers, you're going to have to deal with protecting plants until they can get above the browse, and or using a combination of plants that are less palatable to deer. And both can work. I think the key on growing them in is you have to give them up above the 5-foot height if they're woody plants. A lot of herbaceous plants, the woodland plants, are often more susceptible to deer browse, but open area plants are more adapted to browse. They tend to do better. So it might be in some cases doing a combination of things. Where you can control deer, do it. Protect plants as you can. Sprays and things are not they aren't really effective in the long term. They can be effective in a garden situation where you can change your management over time, but not in a restoration planting per se. So you're looking there then more at physical barriers, whether it's limited amounts of protection around clumps of plants or individual plants, and then trying to get the plants up above the browse and mix up less palatable with more palatable plants. So the less palatables will kind of shield the more palatable plants over time. What other questions do we have from folks?
And if you'd like to ask questions out loud, you can just please use the raise hand feature.
We've exhausted everybody.
You were very comprehensive. One new message.
Okay. So we've got someone who works at a school that shares a property line with Huntley Meadows. They struggle with the swampy soil conditions, compacted soil, native plant covers, or some. Okay, so what would be really cool is there's a couple thoughts. One is thinking about basically the question is looking at swampy soil conditions or next to Huntley Meadows, kind of thinking about kids are trampling the turf area because a lot of kids running around. Recommendations on ground covers are symbiotic with the park. So a couple thoughts. One is that, yes, I think there are a number of things. And one of the most interesting things would be potentially working in concert with Huntley Meadows and Earth Sangha to bring some of the really interesting natives that thrive in Huntley Meadows out into your landscape. So for instance, if your soils are really saturated, it may be that you're actually in a remnant of a wetland system that, and those portions of your property that could harbor things like these sedge species that form these really extensive areas in Huntley Meadows. There are also wonderful plants like the native blue flag iris that grows in Huntley Meadows. There are fern species that grow there. I would really encourage you to look into that. Maybe talk with Dave Lawler at Huntley, maybe get Earth Sangha involved as a partner at your school. And then maybe try to limit traffic within the wettest soil zones if you can. That might be helpful because wherever you have high foot traffic, you're probably going to have more trampling. You could then think about things like path rush, which is a native that thrives in both saturated and drier conditions and can handle traffic. And then, maybe grade some of those more tolerant species in terms of the traffic, and then grade into the areas that are a little less tolerant and try to keep the foot traffic out of there a little bit more. But I would suggest some of those species might really be helpful for you. And there are things like Chasmanthium laxum, which is a native grass that grows in Huntley Meadows in these margin areas between the wetland and the drier upland. That's a really cool grass that forms an interesting clump and lays over. Grasses like that, along with the sedges and the ferns, might really provide some great ground covers for you. The reason for transpiration, so it's really to move water from where it's available down in the ground plane, the rhizosphere, up to the phyllosphere and to the other plant tissues. So all the plant tissues need water for their physical processes and to keep the cells hydrated. So it's just it's the way plants basically the way plants evolve to be able to have differentiated tissues that are above the ground level, away from where the water is available. So they're able to pull it through the roots up to those other tissues well above the ground. Which developed stormwater management, possible to add retrofit to reduce stormwater runoff. So talking about the Dyke Marsh area and adding retrofits to reduce runoff. So the Dyke Marsh area, the biggest issue I think that's faced in urban systems is redevelopment going to occur? It's hard to go into private property and retrofit it because you don't own the land and you don't have the space. What you can do is a combination of things. I know we're looking at this in several areas in the county, is working with the communities and working with Soil and Water Conservation District and other partners to try to help people retrofit their own properties, whether or not they look at rain barrels, they look at retrofitting the lawn and putting more native plants in, putting more trees in, looking at ways to reduce the runoff from the individual lots. Retrofitting existing facilities is easier. So if there's an existing stormwater pond or other facility, that can be easier. It's harder to try to go in and put new facilities in, especially if it's individual lots. So the Dyke Marsh area, the surroundings, is one of the harder spaces to retrofit. So I think the outfall type projects like Quandra Road, where we can keep the sediment down, are probably some of the best bets in those areas. But the retrofits, I think you'd have to really try to work with the different property owners to try to get them to take positive measures on their own properties to reduce that runoff. The name of the hike where you experienced the quiet day. Oh, that's Channels Natural Area Preserve. And I have to tell you, I happened there. It was actually a period of my life where I was not super happy. I had things going on that were negative. But I took that walk and it's about 3.5 miles from the trailhead into the site. And it was a cold spring day and there were almost no people. And I have to say, I'm sitting on that bald next to an old fire tower and there was no people around. And there was one of those moments when there were no aircraft, there's no roads. It was actually one of the quietest moments of my life in terms of just silence. It's really cool. So I can't guarantee if you go there, it won't be a windy day or there won't be a lot of people, but it was, so Channels Natural Area Preserve. You can look it up on the Virginia Natural Heritage website, and the trailhead comes off of the road that goes through Hayter's Gap. Actually, they call it Hyder's Gap, as the locals call it, that runs between Washington County or Abingdon, Virginia, west across Brumley Mountain towards Route 19 on the other side. So look for the Hyder's Gap road. It's actually a really pretty drive. Any other thoughts or questions? I know we're running up on our time. I'll let Dorothy and Glenda intervene here and let us know what we want to do.
I'm trying to intervene. Thank you so much. I think we have reached almost 9, and
Yeah.
It was a wonderful talk, Charles. We really appreciate it. Appreciate your educating us on the science and on all these amazing sites around the country, but also many of them right here in Fairfax County that most of us, or many of us, have probably never seen. So thank you very much. Deborah, do you have anything else you want to say?
No, just thank you. It was wonderful.
Okay, and thank you everybody for participating. We'll see
right.
you in Dagmarsh.
Great. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Night.
Have a good night.
Thanks to everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Right.